Hi, in this video we will learn about session handling and how we do after user login into the app. For example, if a user login to the application for the second time, he doesn't need to see the login screen again and the application start from the home screen. So in order to do that, let's get to the coding. First, we need a shared preference object in order to store the session or flags and locally to which indicate us like if the user is login or not. How do we do that? I will create another module. After creating a module class, I will create a function which provides the shared preferences object. And for the shared preferences, we also need application context. I will create another class as an object and will create constants for the shared preferences, like to keep the shared preferences name and also keys there. And we are using mode private that because we need to store the new values at the place of old values. We don't need the old values every time we store the new values. And I will pass that shared preference object to the repository. So in two of the cases, we need to store the session locally. One is the registration cases and one is the login cases. Because after user successfully register, we also redirecting that user to the not listing screen. So what I will do is to create a function which will name it as a store session and will pass two of the parameters. One is user ID and second one is a lambda function which will give us user object. Now in the Firestore, if you can see the user collection, in the user collection we have documents with the user ID. So under that document we have user information. We need to get that document from the that collection. Once we get that document, we'll convert that document to the user object and will store locally. As you can see, two of the function, one is with parameter and one is without parameter. So without parameter, a function it creates a new document from the scratch, but with parameter it also creates a new document with specific path which we pass in that parameter. But in our case, we will get that document of that specific path. We already know that about these two function. One is add-on complete listener, second one is add-on failure listener. So in the parameter, I need to create another one as a lambda function with having parameter user. In add-on complete listener, I will check if it's successful. In that case, I will convert that document snapshot to the user object and will invoke the result callback. I will make it optional because in the failure case, I will return the null value. In that case, we will assume that we don't have any user existing on the database. As soon as we get the user object from the Firestore, in that case, we need to store that object locally in the shared preferences as well. In order to save that, we already passing the shared preferences object to the repository. In that case, I will use that object, make it edit and put string, and I will create another variable in the constant and will name it user session and we'll use that variable there. We also need JSON library in order to convert the JSON object to the model class and model class to the JSON. I will go to the repository module and will pass the JSON object. But first we need to implement the library. Before passing JSON object to the repository, first we need to have a function in the app module which provide the JSON dependency to avoid the runtime crash. One thing we forget that we need to annotate as a singleton as well. Singleton. Yeah, so that is pretty much done from app module. Now we'll pass that JSON to the repository JSON, and there we also need to create JSON. Yeah, so that is pretty much regarding JSON to JSON user. Okay, and then we will call apply. Now what we pass user ID and result lambda function, we get that document from the user collection. As soon as we get in from the collection, we will get a callback and add on completion listener. If that is successful, what we did is like the result turn into the user object, and the user object we store in the shared preferences after converting that into the JSON, are passing that user object as well in the lambda function. In case of failure or not successful, in that case we passing null. So that is pretty much regarding storing the session. Let's get to the calling that function in two of the places. One is the register case and one is the failure case. So in the register case, we also need to call store the session, but we need to pass two of the things. One is ID, and how do we get that? Let's just task results and Firebase user, then we have UID. In this case we pass empty string as the session store. In that case we will invoke the another function. As soon as the user created, and it return that success, like user registered successfully as the session store. What if the session get failed or throw exception? In that case we also pass user is equal to null. In that case, else we'll pass the failure case with a message user registered successfully but session failed to store. It because we are referring to that object which we will get from the lambda function. So that is pretty much done in the registration process. How about the login process? In the login process, there we are. In that case, same is the case, like store local session ID is equal to task dot result dot user UID, and then callback. If it is equal to null, else if it's null, then in that case we pass failure, login success, no, login failed, but we'll name it as a message should be like failed to store local session. Okay, so let me repeat what we did in the registration and login function. In the registration, what we call, like as soon as the user update the info on the Firestore, in the success case we calling a function store session. We are giving the user ID and also a lambda function passing as we get the user object. That means the user object is existing in the Firestore there as a documents. If that exists, the user object will be not null. If it's null, then we are passing the failure, user registered successfully but session failed to store. And if it's success case, then we will pass the success message. In the login case, same is the case, like we are calling the function store ID, passing the user ID, storing session, passing the user ID, and lambda function. If it's null, we are giving error message. If it's success, then login successfully, and we calling that function store session. Now how about like checking the session? In that case, we'll create another function, but I guess we need to that put on the create another fun get session. We are returning user object, not directly but through the lambda function get session. Yeah, I'll go out to the, let's put our right there. Now get session. In the get session, what we need is to get that user object from the shared preferences. User is equal to app preferences. We already know that the key to store that user object is there, copy, and also default value should be null. Okay, now if user is equal to null, pass null object in invoke else variable. Let's just call as a str because string will be getting from the shared preferences. Now name this variable as a user. Now you will use JSON from JSON and user str user class.java, and we'll pass that in invoke. And that's how we are pretty much done with the session. There is another way to also check with the Firebase, but I am teaching you in a way like you can do later with another scenario as well apart from Firebase. Like in Firebase, I can simply check easily in this way: auth get current user. If that is not null, it's mean like the user is logged in. Okay, so that is pretty much regarding to the session. Now what we do is why the module is giving error. Okay, now app references JSON. Okay, calling this function in auth v model. Okay, getting session, get session, and result. We know that we are passing user. Okay, and repository get session, but I'm just passing that lambda function from there. Okay, why it's giving error? Because both are not match. Now it's pretty much good to go with it. Okay, so that is the first screen which is appearing on the app. What we need to see is to check that in the on start. Now it seems fine. Now we'll check the failed to store local session. And why is that? I think we need to debug that because I'm not really sure why it's not storing the session. And for debugging the process, we'll go to the login function and we'll put some check breaks there, breaking point. Okay, now add that and press again. This time user ID is this one. We'll get expression, copy that value, and let's match it there. I don't think it's existing there. df ID start with df. Let's just check it in the authentication tab. df is existing, but that document is not existing there. So for some reason, I think it's might delete it, or I delete it. Then later on, I forget about to remove that from the authentication tab as well. Okay, it's debugging running. We'll create a new account from the start. I haven't registered yet. Let's just mute that breaking points. Okay, now we'll do a register, and remember that we also have a session on register function as well. Registration successfully but failed to store the session. Why is that? Okay, what was the name? Tester. That is authentication tab, tester. The ID start from LB, and Firestore database, go to the user collection. Okay, it is correctly, there is something wrong with the ID is there is actually different from the ID what we get there is different. We'll check that in the coding, like in the update user info part. We'll go to the auth repository, and the function we have that is update user info, and that is actually, that was the reason, because every time we create a new document and we are assigning that document ID to that user, but we should not do that. What we actually need to do that is the ID we have in authentication tab as the user register, then we should use that ID as a document ID in order to retrieve the information from the Firestore. And there we are doing is like assigning the document ID, like the new document, and assigning that ID as a user ID. So that is actually wrong. Okay, we'll revert back to the user. Okay, you don't need to add that user ID as well. We actually need to change there before passing it. We know that how to get that user ID, and we'll change that there. Now it's pretty much fine. We'll run the application, and I will clear also these documents as well, because that is actually wrong. In that case we don't need them. We need to have fresh data with correct information. Go to the authentication, let's just delete from there. Okay, and click on register button. Now we'll see if that is working. User register successfully but failed to store. Now we have the user ID start with YYQ. Okay, this time the correct ID is inside the document but not using as a document ID. I think we should use as a document ID as well, and we'll use user ID. Now it is pretty much fine this time. Let's just delete, and I'm promising you this time it will work. Now this time click on haven't registered yet. Okay, yes, here we are, it's working. And to clarify, like, is the session really stored in the shared surfaces? I will go to the device file explorer. We'll go to the data, again data, and what is the package name of this is the com example Firebase with MVVM. Firebase with MVVM. Open that shared preferences, and we have local shared pref. And here we are. That session is stored with the key user session and having all the information done with the session. And we just tested with the registration case. Let's just check out in the login case as well. On the logout, we also need to delete that or make the value empty in the shared preferences, because we have on condition on login. So every time we need a logout, it will go there and will check again the session, because the object is still there in the shared preferences. So that's why it will never let us to log out. Where okay, not listing screen, logout. I think in the logout case we'll go to the repository. Okay, there. From there, f references, edit. This time I will just copy and paste and make that null. Now it is pretty much fine. Let's just run the application. As you can see, the application start from the not listing screen, not from the login screen. Now I'll click on the logout, and boom, it's working fine. I'll check the again of which there 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 and 8. Click on the login successfully. Let's just close the application. Okay, so far we learned about how we do session handling in the application. especially like I did in the Firebase case, but you can get that idea and use it with the other scenarios as well. And let me just quickly repeat that. What I did is like to have two different functions, store session and get session. Store session is actually like as the user login or register, we are passing the user ID, and this information we have stored in the user collection. Under that user ID, we get that document and convert that to the user object, and then store that in the shared preferences as a JSON. Okay, so that is the storing part, and the getting session part is actually getting that session from the shared preferences and convert that to the user object and pass that user object render function to the live view model, and through the view model we get that in the fragment, and in the login fragment we are checking if that user object is not actually null, then we are giving good to go with the flow to not listing screen. So that is pretty much regarding to the session.